Welcome to another episode of Earth Magic Tree Keeper podcast. I'm your host, Camilla Blossom. Honoring the earth and tree mysteries will take a moment with me to remember and feel your connection with the grandmothers, the ancient trees, and Mother Earth's love. Let us attune to the spirit of the trees, the fairy and elementals, ancestors and ancient ones. Be inspired by intimate stories of spiritual earth initiation, tree spirit medicine, magical journeys, special guests, and energetic light weaving of co-creative, intuitive relationships with the seen and unseen realms of nature. Today, I have a special treat for us. Michael Dunning is here from the U Mysteries. He's called the U Shaman. And I'm going to introduce him now by just sharing a little of his background, and then we'll get into it. So Michael was born and raised in Scotland and now lives in rural Massachusetts. He's an international recognized speaker and teacher and founder of the U Mysteries. It's a mystery school based on the direct transmission of the ancient wisdom of the yew tree, Awaz. He also runs a busy biodynamic craniosacral practice and teaches that work as well as the U Mysteries in UK and USA, and I think more places in Europe too. Michael has a background in the visual arts, having graduated from the Edinburgh College of Art, and as a former professional jazz musician, has toured widely with various ensembles, physical theater, and contemporary dance companies. A regular guest on spiritually flavored podcasts, Michael has also written for magazines such as Indie Shaman, The Sacred Hoop, and a Journal of Contemporary Shamanism. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Camilla. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm so thrilled. Michael and I got to hang out a lot at the last Fairy Congress this summer of 2024.
We did.
And really dive into our love and joy of the trees and work with some of the yew trees, Pacific yew at the site. I have been a longtime tree hugger, a tree lover, worked with that medicine as well. And I've really found Michael not only a joy to hang out and learn some of his language, his fun language of Scotland that my ancestors used to say, but also just being with you, Michael, I could feel that strong presence that you carry, that like you carry the medicine of the you know, you embody it. And so even if you don't know anything about the yew tree, you don't know about, you know, the medicine or those kind of ideas of it, right? Or what it's about. It's like I could really feel that just being with you. There's such a peace and a calm and a deep, deep medicine that's so beautiful. And I know that when you do teach and share it, you're introducing others. And so here on this podcast, to really invite all of those listening to welcome and receive that energy, that medicine, that frequency, open to not just the words you say. I know you teach a lot like me, right? In a more shamanic way, where you're allowing those transmissions to happen, that like sacred knowledge, that wisdom that you carry. And I think for a lot of us that are, you know, more US people that have come from Celtic homelands, there's a strong desire to feel that belonging, you know, having that longing to belong to more of the ancestors and to the trees and to the forest. And so I think you bring that through as well as in that. But those are just sort of my kind of perspective. So I'd love to dive in and just invite you to share anything that kind of comes to mind, and I can ask you questions. I just want to introduce two people to the tree behind me. I just met last week in Oregon, just southeast of Portland, Oregon, in a forest called Eagle Fern Park. And this one is a Pacific yew. And you can see how red the bark is. It's very magical when you find them. So yeah, so we'll welcome Pacific yew. I know you're going to talk about the yews from the UK as well. So you can share more. But yeah, so I'll let you start off kind of what is opening, especially we're in the winter solstice right in this moment. And we kind of had talked about getting together and doing this. And I love how it kind of landed in this timing, right? It's like, oh my gosh, this is perfect. This is like that. I always think of it as the breath between the in-breath and the out-breath of Gaia, of Mother Earth, right? Where there's sort of that pause, that reset, that movement, kind of in that void, sacred void, birth space. So welcome.
Thank you, Camilla. Thank you for your words. And yeah, I had a great time with you as well at the Congress. We didn't really know each other before then, particularly. We knew of each other, but we hadn't spent a lot of time together. So it was wonderful to have the car rides and to camp in the same area and to just spend some time. And I really, really enjoyed sharing, listening to your stories too, and sitting on the edge of the water up in Portland,
Yeah,
chatting and
the
eating.
Columbia River. Yeah.
Yes, it was lovely. And you know, it's really interesting just to pick up on something you said about the Pacific yew. And you know, really the I was surprised by just how just the power of the yews in the Pacific Northwest. And as I was slowly introduced to those, I was really awed by the presence of those trees, although they're not as old as the yews I was used to spending time with in Scotland, particularly. The the presence of the trees was very strong. And I think to me that implied some kind of sense of that the yews had been there for since ancient times in the Pacific Northwest. And we know that they had, you know, had been cut down at certain times for, especially in the search for more recent times, the search for cure for cancer and things like that. So a lot of the Pacific yews were lost. And now I think they're hopefully protected again. But there are some ancient yews in North America. There's one on Galliano Island in British Columbia, which is an ancient male yew, a white yew we call these. They're sort of blanched, so ancient. There's a sort of whiteness to them, a sort of boniness, a sort of that kind of quality of age that comes. And that's right on a beach on Galliano. So there is evidence that the ancient yew once perhaps flourished there. Also one on the rainforest there, the
The
Pacific
Olympic
Northwest,
Peninsula, is
Olympic
that where
Peninsula.
you said you saw one? Yeah.
Yeah, a very old one. It looked very European to me. It was just kind of interesting, very similar morphology. But also what's really interesting to me was being in the Northeast here is the presence of the Taxus canadensis, which is they call it ground hemlock, but it's actually yew. And it tends to spread across the forest floor and also grows into these kind of rock crevices and fills them out like sort of great kind of pillows of yew that you can almost kind of settle into and lie on top of. And so I've been quite amazed to have discovered around me, everywhere around me, this yew that is like a skin. It's like a skin that kind of grows across. It grows horizontally. It grows across the ground. And there's a really interesting principle in that notion of the skin-like quality of the yew surrounding, creating an enclosure. It's almost like the sense of sort of creating a cloak for the earth around here in certain places. And I think left to its own devices, it would become quite prevalent. Of course, now it's only in certain areas, but when I first came here 20 odd years ago, I kept feeling the presence of the yew and I couldn't quite understand. And I realized, wait a second, there's something about the ground here that's calling me. And when I paid closer attention, there were these little boughs of yew coming up from the understory of the forest, you know, and spreading laterally and peripherally and horizontally. And I thought, the yew is a skin here. It has a different morphology. It has a different principle. It lives in a different way. So that was a very interesting discovery to make. And it kind of brings me in a way, it sounds kind of a random thing to say, but it brings me to this notion of the yew's relationship to the winter solstice. Because oddly, there's a sort of a there's a relationship to obviously to the horizon with the solstice, and where the sun appears to disappear, and there's a still point in time. There's that sort of pause that you talked about at the beginning, where in ancient times we might have said the earth was impregnated, by the power of the sun. And for a long time, I've been talking, in the yew mysteries about the significance of the horizon. And there's a great significance to the horizon in terms of how we understand the other world. The ancient Egyptians understood this. They had this notion of Akhet, the radiant place. The horizon was the radiant place, the birthplace of the gods. Very, very similar to the notion in the solstice of where this rebirth, this death and rebirth takes place, where the god is reborn through the still point in time. And there's a rebirth that takes place. And in the Norse traditions, the ear was the younger Futhark rune for the yew, was very, very closely associated with the solstice, with the winter solstice. So there's a very, very deep understanding of this tree of life and death as being very, very related to the winter solstice. And there's a kind of big story. There's actually a very big story behind all of that is quite rich and quite deep, that maybe that people would be interested in knowing a little bit about, perhaps. Yeah. Because when you think about this, the horizon, there's something magical about that horizon, isn't there, really? I mean, it doesn't really reveal itself, and yet it allows rhythmicity to break through. It allows her to have a distinction between day and night, light and dark. It allows there to be a seasonal change. We have this invisible principle almost. The horizon doesn't really reveal itself as what it is, and yet it allows things to be revealed. And there's something about that is very, very important in terms of the work that I was doing with the yew mysteries for a long time. And that's got a lot to do with the notion of this kind of origin point, this where something emerges from the horizon. There's a kind of a force, a rejuvenative, healing force that comes from the horizon, that arises, it comes to us. And I think this is something that many people in the healing arts have understood, particularly in the biodynamic craniosacral community. They have a notion of the long tide, this principle of healing, health, that appears to come or seems to come from the horizon and passes through all life and actually animates and sustains life. And it's almost like the reimagination or the reinvigoration of an older idea, because ancient Egyptians also had this notion, birth of the gods, this radiant place where this kind of original force comes from. In the yew mysteries, I often say that the horizon is a doorway to the other world. And that there's a lateral, peripheral, horizon-like aspect to the other world that's often missed in our teachings. We often think of the other world as subterranean, something that is beneath. But actually, the principle of the other world, I think there's a much more supple and living principle of the other world that we can actually come into relationship with the horizon. And Go ahead.
It reminds me of the idea of like the fairy realm being in the in-between place, like the power of the edges of the forest or the valleys, right? It really, when you're talking about it, it's like, oh yeah, it's between that place, that kind of place of mystery where the dark and the light live, or
Exactly right. It's a
yeah,
liminality. You know,
yeah,
it's the
yeah,
the
that's a great
liminal
word.
place. And you know, the Irish Tir na Nog was the afterlife, was this place across an ocean somewhere. And what's really interesting is somewhere across a flat plain. There's a planar quality to kind of traveling, to moving out to this place of origin or this place of eternity, let's say, that's breaking through into time. And I think that there's something in what I'm saying there that really is, it gets to the core of not only the solstice, winter solstice, but also of the U mysteries, where this kind of sense of eternity breaking forth into into the into the manifest world, into the earthly realm. And the ancient Egyptians often, when they would talk about uh, returning to their homelands, it was again across an ocean. It was across a flat plain. There was a notion of planar travel. So I think there's something there that we've kind of we've missed a little bit in our understanding of kind of the other world, the underworld, and a lot of that has to do with uh, I think a lot of that has to do with what what is it that we're defining as the sun in that situation, because we think of the solar orb as descending into the earth, which it does, you know, seems to at the solstice time, where the tilt of the earth is furthest away from the you know, the equator is the tilt of the earth, um, gives us the impression that scientifically that you know the sun is literally pouring itself into the earth at that time. Um, and one of the things that for me during my experiences with the U, and I'm jumping around a bit here, but hopefully it will all start to connect. Um, when I first started spending time at the U, probably 1993, around about that time, where I had been eventually called to this being. The U I spent time as in completely enclosed being. There's a 40-foot long tunnel of branches into this chamber. In the center of the chamber stands a trunk, and the branches grow out from the trunk and back down to the earth to create an entirely concealed chamber. And when I went in there at first, it was very clear that there was something separate about the space, the inner space of that U chamber, to the way the world was manifesting outside of that chamber. And even in my time, I was very sick at the time, so in many ways my senses were very heightened. But as soon as I entered that space, there was something other about it. And from that time, I went through this period of 9, 10 years of just going through this process of healing and transmission from the U. Of course, at that time, I had no idea what was going on. And gradually, one has to develop and understand, trying to find a language for these things. But one of the things I began to realize was that the U was revealing uh, an expression of a sort of timelessness, a sort of a world that kind of preceded the world as it had become manifest today. There was something, the otherness of it was not just about its ancientness, but it was also about revealing something that preceded the manifestation of this world. And it took me a long time to really understand that. And I began to realize it through the time of being under that U, that the healing forces that were being transmitted, that were affecting, initiating my healing, were coming through that portal. Were coming through that kind of sense of otherness, that I couldn't be healed outside of that U. There was something different about being in that space that was actually transmitting the healing. And over time, I began to understand, oh, wait a minute. And as one begins to research and tries to understand and develop a language, this is kind of what the other world is about here. There's an original world, a primal world that kind of birthed this world, that the you somehow has maintained the expression and it maintained the reality of a world that precedes this one. That it lives inside an order of being that is not the dominant order. It's not really living by the laws of nature as we understand them. It's different. And it was that was affecting the healing. And
Would you, can I interject here?
no, please go as many
Would
times as you
you, like the way you describe it, certain things kind of are coming to the surface. This feeling like the tree as the womb of creation, inviting you back into, I know you talk about embryonic connections in your work, but it just feels so much like you're the child, the baby that needs the healing, and you're invited into this timeless place, like a sacred void of the womb of creation, like you say before. Before the creation we know. In a sense too, like that all these ancestors, yours and the ancestors of these trees, like have been doing this for eons, but there aren't many people in this time frame that really got to enter like you did. So anyway, I'm just sort of
yes, no.
thinking.
No, I think that's a really nice a nice
Yeah.
way of putting it. And I think bringing that notion of the embryology, the embryonic aspect to it, I sometimes refer to the you as the embryonic tree of life. And it's not just for me, and this is I'm writing a lot about this in my book. That there's a memoir I'm writing. I've been writing for as my friends and people in the U Mysteries joke, it's like it's moving along at U time, so probably be ready in a couple of thousand years from now, but because the U, as people know, the U grows extremely slowly. And I should say to the people who are not familiar with the U that the U I spent time with, maybe we can add a picture later on.
Yeah.
The U I spent time with is multiple thousands of years old. Now, there's a lot of controversy right now around minimizing the ages of the U's, particularly in the UK, to try and gain more scientific credence and try not to get too overblown. But from the mind of the U itself, what I call the mind of the U, the kind of consciousness of the U, my sense with there's this being that's pre-Atlantean, that that being was there as the world was consolidating itself. And somehow it was able to be a custodian of the original forces that created the earth itself as in its current form. And those were the forces that were doing the healing. And
Yeah,
people,
and it's
embryonic,
interesting. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if it was you, but someone said something about the you, like talking about energy fields, how trees, connect, of course, with heaven and earth, the cosmic and the physical. And their energy field kind of flows like ours does through the central trunk or channel and then flowing around. But that the yew tree doesn't run its energy that way. So it makes me really think like what you're saying. Oh yeah, there's something different about how it even holds its energy, how it flows its energy. That's like kind of like what, like helping us kind of shift. I don't know. Do you have anything to say on that one?
yeah, it's really a kind of living, its livingness is to do with its spatiality. So for me, everything about the U reverses almost everything we think we know. And in fact, the Awaz, the rune from here is the tree that grows both downwards and upwards at the same time. So there's a quality of reversal, inversion, involution that the U speaks to. So whereas in the New Age kind of world, people tend to talk about use the word energy, which I don't tend to use, and as a kind of linear kind of thing or a midline thing or something. I tend to really, because of the U, tend to start to think of periphery, spatiality, horizon, something coming in, rather than what's coming from us, what's coming to us. And then it kind of takes this kind of quality of locking ourselves down in we're centering ourselves, we're the center, to actually that it's the divine that centers us. You know, we can
That's
be
beautiful.
synchronized with that, but it's really the divine that centers us, and that's a more of a peripheral experience. So for me, the use speaks the language of a kind of an etheric space, a spatiality, and a shaping process, an inner space that is separated from the way the world is today. So it's an embryonic type of space. So when you enter that space of the you, you're subjecting yourself, submitting in a way to an order of livingness, kind of a living space that actually is entirely different from the space outside in the normal world. And things will begin to happen. So it is like a kind of like a womb space, like an embryonic space. But for me, the way my healing progressed under that tree was very much like I couldn't find a language for the healing.
Right.
I had been an art student. I didn't know anything about New Age stuff. I didn't know anything about shamanism. I didn't know what these things were. And I had a friend of mine who was an anthropologist, and he'd been with a peripatetic African tribe, and his PhD was all about that. I knew his wife very well, was a great friend of mine, and she said to me, why don't you talk to Justin, my husband, and he might have some ideas for you. And he was the first person to introduce me to this notion of shamanism. And he said
Mm.
to me, I think you're going through some kind of shamanic thing. It's like the kind of tree of life, and there's this thing going on. And he taught a night class on shamanism. So he gave me all his notes that he gives to the students, It was very nice of him. And I had this big pile about this thick of notes, and I was reading through them, and it was fascinating and interesting. And that's where I discovered Mircea Eliade and all of these classical writers in shamanism. And I liked it. There's a lot there for me, but there was something missing, always missing. You're like, yeah, this is really great. And it gave me a sort of way into thinking about it. And but it was only when I started studying embryology through when I'd gone into study biodynamic, craniosacral therapy actually was a great doorway for me to helping to understand the you better and my own healing process better, because the embryology started showing me images and gestures that appeared to be echoing my own experiences of healing beneath the you. There was a peripheral quality. When you're an embryo, you're all periphery. Before you have this physical body, you're a sentient being on the outside as a skin, as a membranous, peripheral, whole being. So consciousness doesn't arise with the central nervous system. Consciousness is already present. There's already a sentience in that wholeness of the early embryo before it has actually consolidated into what we call a
Mm.
body here. So there's always an outside to inside differentiation in how we come to be. Now, that principle there, what I just said there, is massive, because that outside to inside differentiation is not
Mm.
just something that we follow as an individual, it's something that the entire development of the earth has followed. So the embryology that you see in our own development, that I saw in my healing, and I thought to myself, my God, these forces that are actually these embryonic forces are identical forces to the forces that are healing me. And I began to think, this is the language, this
Mm.
scientific language, when understood in a different way, suddenly becomes a key to understanding something huge. Now, I'm not the first to talk about this. I mean, Rudolf Steiner had a way of an anthroposophical medicine it talks about this a little bit. And those things helped me later on when I found them. But this experience all took place in the raw, so to speak. So discovering the embryology, I began to understand this principle. And I'm going to jump here a little bit and we can come back. This takes me back to the horizon, and it takes me back to the winter solstice, because there's something about that horizon where what was once an outside, like an embryo, begins to become consolidated, and it has to come through a still point, it has to come through some kind of fulcrum, and then it becomes an inside, then it becomes manifest. And there's something there about the principle of the other world being through the horizon and beyond, and bringing forth through this kind of still point, bringing through the still point in time, breathing through the manifest earth. So when we get to the winter solstice, I feel that at this time, the winter solstice, the earth becomes, in a sense, really itself. It's almost like a recapitulation, a reenactment of an original involution of the other world. The other world, which was a great outside, involutes itself, just as happens in embryology, and bursts out the physicality of the earth. So there's an involution process that goes on that is actually a subtle thing. One has to really kind of get inside of it, its fulcrum, to understand it. So during the winter solstice, there's a moment where that's why it's so important to the ancient world. For a moment, we can feel we have this experience of the original world bursting forth, the original otherworldly forces rebirthing the earth, just as it in the old teachings, the god was reborn at the solstice. So there's a great principle there of, if we can synchronize with the winter solstice, with the Yule tide. Now that's an interesting phrase too, the tide, this movement, this tidal movement of solstice. Solstice is a tidal movement. It's a coming into being. The earth becomes its most earthly at that time, and it becomes its most manifest. It's kind of all of the elemental beings, all of these forces that in the summer are diffused out into the plants and into the atmosphere, become at their most condensed at that point. And in an alchemical term, you could say it becomes its most salt. It becomes this great salt principle, where this great potency is gathered, and the earth becomes very potent, like a seed. So the winter solstice has a great import for us in terms of potency of the earth, and this inner quality, this quality of potentizing for the spring to come, for when it starts to reverse itself, and we begin to see the forces, elemental beings, the intelligence of the earth lifting off the earth and moving back out into then more of a sulfur process. So the old alchemist would say, from the Middle Ages perhaps, would say that, the earth represents more of a sal, they might say. The hydrosphere, the water of the earth, represents the more mercury principle. The earth has a fluid body. It's not just the oceans as they appear, but the actual fluidity of the earth passes beyond the physicality of the planet into this more hydrospheric fluid body. And then beyond that, there's the sulfur process, which is much more of a cosmic, we get much more into the otherworldliness in that kind of more sulfurous realm. But in the midwinter, all of that stuff with the descent of the sun all comes down, and it all comes down into the earth. And there's a sort of rebornness.
It's interesting you say that, because, I know there's definitely a lot of the fairy and beautiful plant energy that I feel in the spring and the summer. But then there's something I love about the fall moving into winter. It's like things are more alive now. And I think you just explained that. Like there's something about like walking in the woods in the fall and into the winter where it's like, wow, there's just like a potency. And so I love that you're describing it that way, because it's like sometimes you think, oh, all the, people say, oh, all the nature spirits are asleep, but the fairies, I'm like, well, I don't feel that. I feel like this intense.
No, they're not asleep. They're hard at work.
Yeah, but it's just
potentizing.
very concentrated. So
Exactly.
in the summer, you might go in the same forest and feel this sense of expansion and lightness and, more of that kind of etheric quality with the grounding, but then yeah, that very different quality. So I love that.
And
But it
then
also,
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
well, do you want to say something on that? Because I have something else
Yeah, just to
different.
just to
Okay,
jump
go
on
ahead.
something you said, because it's a kind of another important principle. The U is often called the iron wood or the red wood, as is visible right behind you in the red wood here. But
Mhm.
iron, I came upon something again through my own healing process under the U was through the blood. There was a very big principle of I had formed a relationship with my blood in a way that I won't try and go into too much just now, but going back to the kind of natural world during the time of the high point of autumn, of the fall, there's the highest kind of concentration of cosmic iron. There's a kind of drawing down of the cosmic iron during that kind of period of autumn. And that ties in with the stories of Saint Michael with the iron sword, bringing the dragon forces, slaying the dragon, which really means to kind of bring those dragon forces into the earth, so to speak.
Mm.
So there's a kind of iron principle at work here, where in the kind of fall and into the winter, there's a way where that iron begins to become much more of an earthly force as well. The kind of iron is brought down to earth. There's a sort of incarnational aspect to iron. Iron ignites incarnation. So the earth goes through this kind of incarnational fire through the winter time, with this kind of the iron drawn down into the earth, you know. So I think there's another principle there around the iron. And it's interesting that the U was called the iron wood.
Mm.
And it's not because iron's a strong wood. That's what people would say. Well, you know, a post of U outlasts a post of iron. Was why it was, people say, well, that's why it was called the iron wood. But actually it was called the iron wood because there's something incarnational about the U. The U brings in these forces from the other world as kind of incarnational forces. So that when you go through a healing experience beneath a yew tree, it's particularly what I call a fulfilled yew, a yew that has been able to live into its original form. And that original form was, just as I described, a form that has an outside and an inside. Not just a tree that's growing out and being drawn out by the cosmos, but a tree that says, I'm going to turn away from the sun because I reflect a different kind of principle that's not necessarily solar in the way that we understand the world now. And it actually turns away from the sun and begins to express an older order, a pre-solar order. So when you're in the presence of a you're in the presence of a pre-solar intelligence, an intelligence that existed before. I know this sounds controversial, and you know, but the you certainly pictured this to me. It showed me that it was a being that existed pre-solar.
Oh, wow.
It existed in a realm that was not ruled by the sun as we see it today in the sky. And where this links a wee bit with the winter solstice, and I might be jumping here, so I apologize.
Fine.
When you think of the Romans, the Romans had their festival during this time, was called Saturnalia. And Saturnalia was dedication to Saturn. And in the ancient world, Saturn was the original sun. Not the solar orb. Saturn was the original
Okay.
the polar star, the pole star, this kind of firm heart in the sky. The Egyptians called it Atum Ra. Atum Ra was another name for Saturn. Elohim was another name for Saturn. There are many names. Quetzalcoatl was another Saturnian figure. In the ancient world, it was understood that Saturn was kind of a predecessor, something,
Mm.
a force that had existed earlier than the sun. And so Saturnalia of the Romans. Now, the interesting thing was that the festival of Saturnalia was a festival of reversals.
Mm.
So right in the winter solstice, everything was reversed. So um, kings would serve, the masters would serve slaves. Um, There was a great sexual liberation at the time. Men would dress in animal hides or would dress as women. There would be gifts exchanged. In the Hittite religion, the Ea would have been bedecked with sheepskins and gifts, and all kinds of things would be hung from the tree. So we start to see some of this earlier pagan understanding of 1930s Santa Claus Coca-Cola Christmas, so all of it goes way back, of course. But so this kind of whole notion of Saturnalia was that originally there was a kind of world that was kind of ruled by Saturn. And it was a purple, they called it, there's a whole theory to this. People want to look it up. Please
Okay.
do. It's called the Purple Dawn era.
Mhm.
And the other aspect to this is called the electric universe theory. It's to do with Birkeland currents and electrical kinds of currents that I won't go into just now because I'm be a poor explainer of it. But this notion of this twilight realm that was guided by a brown dwarf star, which was Saturn, and there was a homogeneous warmth would come from that. So there were no seasons on the Earth. There was no day and night. There was a kind of a constant twilight, just as the way we sometimes describe the other world. This kind of. I'm not saying those two are identical, by the way. There's another principle to unravel there, but there was this beginning. This manifest world was beginning to happen here under this auspices of Saturn. There was no day and night. There were no seasons. It was a twilight realm. The people or the beings that were on that planet couldn't see beyond the sheath of Saturn, so they couldn't tell what was beyond. So there was this kind of quality of a Saturnian realm that you see reflected in customs of the ancient world.
Hmm.
So Saturnalia was a very
Hmm.
clear example of that, where Saturn was worshipped, essentially. And Saturn was seen as the planet of reversals, There was something other than what we see today, something original, something other, something preceding the way the world is. And the yew was also known as the tree of Saturn, and it's
Oh,
been known.
okay.
So it was understood as a being whose intelligence harkens back, who holds on as a custodian of the intelligence of that ancient world. And vegetation on that world would have been massive.
Hmm.
Red spectrum light, plants grow way bigger in red spectrum light than they do
Mhm.
in the kind of harsh light of the ultraviolet light of the sun. So all vegetation was red during
There
that
you
time.
go.
There it is.
Red.
And so there's the U begins to, what
Mm.
we see with the U, we begin to get a picture, an image of a realm, a world that preceded ours. And when we start to synchronize with the mysteries of the U, we begin to actually come into a relationship with forces and intelligence that precedes the kind of more hardened consciousness that has come through the solar order over the last so many thousands and thousands of years. So there's a kind of another consciousness breaks through, which is more embryonic, more original,
Mhm.
more healthful, more immediate. It speaks to the blood in a different way. Healing can happen in a way that doesn't happen outside of the parameters of that tree. It's not
Like
really a tree.
miracles. Yeah.
Miraculous. I
Yeah.
mean, what I went through under the tree is, I mean, one has to be very careful not to start to sound like some crazy messianic person with a message for the world. And I certainly, you know, all I can talk about is my own experience.
Yeah.
And for me, being close to death, going into that chamber of that U, and 9+ years later, coming out of that, feeling renewed with a purpose, you know, reluctantly to kind of start to bring,
To come back out into
yeah,
this
bring some,
world.
yeah, bring some of this U mysteries that I didn't have any names for anything then,
Yeah.
and but anyway, suffice it to say that there is something about the U that is like it breaks into this plane from somewhere else. There's a
Yeah.
liminality to the U. that is beyond all other plants. It has a certain unique quality about it that's directly related to the other world and how the earth came to be. And again, there's a direct relationship, as I've explained, with the winter solstice there, that I hope people can follow that.
Yeah, that they can, yeah, invite everyone to really allow this. I feel like a lot of your teachings is helpful to kind of open our mind to like that reversal teaching you're talking about, because we get like really set in our ideas about things. And what it brought up for me too was, talking about the horizon and the importance of that connection. But also like working with a lot of people and helping them ground and using trees and that kind of medicine to help get a sense of how to ground into Gaia. I almost feel like there's a different teaching. Like what I notice, it doesn't always work for everyone. Sometimes they're not so vertically oriented that they need to send their roots down to the center of the earth. Like I have a lot of very high level kind of fairy realm type people, and it's like, I don't know, this isn't really working for them. And it's almost, even that membrane word is coming up. Like this is an understanding of like a more horizontal alignment, or or something really different about how we ground. And I've really been intrigued because I've
Yeah.
been teaching grounding for like 30 years or whatever. And it's always something I start off with people to see how they're doing. But now I'm like seeing people grow new roots, like that old ancestral stuff that's held in some of those roots.
Mm.
Like like they want to grow new roots. And
Mhm.
so I'm seeing that happen, but also I'm kind of like something might be really different about how we're grounding into Gaia, into Mother Earth. And part of it is don't just ground into the third D of her, right? We've got this 5D multidimensional being that we need to expand and connect with all of it. So, connecting with the crystalline grid and all these things. But I'd love to, if there's anything that kind of comes up with like grounding with the you. And I can see too, like I make the tree essences, like how you can work with these energies or vibrations, or even make that medicine um, to invite those kind of energies for your own healing. And just to add to that, like when I stayed at Michael's workshop after the Fairy Congress, there was a group of us that worked with the U, the Pacific U. He had found, or some people had found, like a whole bunch of them there that we didn't
Mhm.
know about in the
Yes,
forest.
it's wonderful.
Oh my God, what was it, like 6 or 8 of them?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And so we were able to visit and be with them, and people had the most profound healing experiences, meditating and working. So seeing, I mean, I feel that potential of trees, but just to kind of witness and see what for each person they were sharing. And these were Pacific views. These weren't even the ones you have worked with in the
Mhm.
UK, but there was such a magic quality to the potential miracles that the trees can bring us, right? That's so I love this whole reversal idea too. But anything about grounding, there's something just felt like you might have some interesting insight.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think there's and I always like to bring his name up because he's a visionary osteopath who died not so long ago, and because of my work in the biodynamic craniosacral community, I've learned the language of that, and that's been really useful to me. And his name was James Jealous, and he would talk about centering around the edges, and that as I said to you earlier, that really we're becoming, if we become used to the notion of that we can be centered on the periphery. We've become far too used to this notion of centering ourselves, or
Yeah.
earthing ourselves, rooting ourselves, sending shoots down into the earth. And I'm not saying any of that's bad, not at
Yeah.
all, but that it's all good. We need it all. We know we need all
Yeah.
of these things, but there's another way. And I think that the dilemma of the modern human being is to do with consciousness. And the way we tend to kind of rigidify, we kind of lock things up in our consciousness. We lock things down. And I say this a lot. We kind of create corpses of the things we see with our senses. So we name things, we give them labels, and we think we know these things because we've named it, because we've grasped it with our consciousness. But all we've done is kill it. All we've done is kill it. I'm saying that more from an alchemical sense of death. There's a death process in consciousness that we as modern human beings are really, it's our challenge is to bring a livingness back into our consciousness. And I think some of the practices that the New Age community is also guilty of locking up consciousness and locking stuff down by overemphasizing, grounding, overemphasizing a kind of particular one-way relationship to nature. In fact, what about the breath? What about the transparency of nature? The way nature breathes through us. There's a transparency to nature, a liminality to nature. It breathes, it moves. It's not locked down anywhere. Where is the earth grounded? Where does it ground itself? It's always moving. It's always it's rhythmicizing. It's always in movement. So when we look at ourselves as an embryo again, we were centered on the periphery. Before we had a body, our center was our periphery. Each one of us, everybody listening to this, all of us, we all have an embodied memory of centering ourselves or being centered on the edges, being centered on the periphery. To be a healthy human being is to have, and I'm going to paraphrase a great craniosacral teacher called Michael Shea. To paraphrase him, our midline needs to be healthy enough to translocate. We have to have a midline that can be consolidated. We have to have a midline that can be peripheral. We have to have transparency. Transparent to what? Transparent to that great healing force that comes from the horizon, that's given us from the other world. The original forces of the other world are available every moment. We're being